Okay, so let's get this out of the way. I don't plan on doing too many videos like this on my channel for a couple of reasons. The first reason is mainly because I just tuned in, or should I say tuned back into Monstercat in the middle of this year, and that's because of looking at other ranking videos. They're a lot more fun to watch than I thought they would be. And the second reason why I don't plan on doing these kinds of videos that often is because I'm an EDM producer myself. So I don't really want to be known for this sort of content, I just want to show that it's one of the many things I enjoy doing. So in this video, I'll be covering my personal highlights and lowlights of Monstercat. We'll start with the lowlights and close with the highlights for this video. Now compared to last year, I don't think there were anywhere near as many tracks that were widely disliked, so I might have some hot takes here. Now, if by any chance you've seen Bayside Park's videos on Monstercat last year, this video will be fairly similar. For both of my lists, there will be one track per artist to make things fair, and it will be Uncaged and Instinct Originals only. This is my personal opinion, and you don't have to agree with any of it. Also, I'll say this in advance, I don't mean any disrespect to the artists in my worst list in particular. So with all of that out of the way, let's start with some dishonorable mentions, which include, but are not limited to, Rush by Bishu and Neve, a dull tech house track with oddly pitched vocals. I'm not entirely sure why he went for that sort of style this year, considering some of his other releases. Next up is Fool Me by Chill. Now, Chill has had a decent debut year, but this track grew off of me quickly. I just can't get behind the repetitive vocal sample used in this drop. Vitamin R by Cod Dubs and Squishy. I've seen a lot of people say that this fits better on the Disciple label, and I don't think I can explain it any better. Hit 'Em Like by Diesel, Chassis, and Cosmos. The overly constant screeches in the first drop are an example of the worst of the wall of noise trend in dubstep. Next up is Inner Fire by Godlands and Plasma, a track that eventually fell off of my worst list. While the drops are very annoying, they're comical enough so that I don't hate it as much as I used to. Ready For It by Muzz featuring Sky L. I don't think anyone was really asking for a drum and bass cover of a Taylor Swift track. At least I certainly wasn't. Next up is War by Nostalgics featuring Rico Nasty. Now, I think Rico Nasty's the main reason why this track is here, because I don't like the vocals whatsoever. Headcase by Odd Kid Out and Hyro the Hero. And on the topic of rap ruining any sort of potential this track once had, I mean, the drops are aggressive, but it's hard to pay attention to them when the vocals get in the way. Repeating by Punctual, another track that eventually fell out of my worst list. Now, the break does have some redeemable factors, but the drop is painfully basic. Endgame by Rebel Scum and Tasha Baxter. All I can really say about this track is that it's a messy neurofunk production all around. Sugar by Sarah DeWarren and Weird Genius, a track that I think will make the worst list for a lot of people, and that's mainly because of its extremely off-putting lyricism. Definitely not Sarah DeWarren's best work considering in real life and Sink or Swim exist. Pursuit of Violence by Sullivan King and Sudden Death, another track that barely misses my worst list. Now, apart from a couple of tracks, Thrones of Blood as a whole is simply not for me. And for this particular track, the screamo is absolutely horrendous. And the last dishonorable mention is Fever by What's So Not and Dactyl. I get that it's a change up from the influx of House on Instinct, but I just cannot stand that lead. And without further ado, it is time for the top 10 worst Monstercat tracks of 2023. When I was first ranking this particular month, I thought there were many bad tracks, yet none of them were awful enough to make my worst list. I'll take that back. I mean, as messy as Vitamin R was, it barely misses this list, because I feel like there are at least a couple of comical moments around it. Here's something that's the opposite of comedy. If there was one word that I think best describes this track, it would be confusing. It starts off with an eerie arpeggio, if you could even call it that, and it remains continuous for almost the entirety of this track. Now, there are a lot of tracks that I dislike for prioritizing elements that I would consider annoying, but I don't even know exactly what the drops are trying to prioritize here. Maybe it's the bass? Even so, everything else about this drop just sounds random. And what makes it worse is that it's pretty much devoid of any sort of energy given the slow and lethargic pacing of it. I could definitely see Sippy learning from this, but it is a clear lowlight for her debut year. You'd probably agree with me when I say that Instinct has had a big step down from last year. First of all, the new release schedule has it so that Instinct would have 1 release per week, while Uncaged would have 3. And on top of that, it seemed like half the time the Instinct release would just be generic commercial or tech house. But here's the thing though. Most of the tracks on my list actively get on my nerves. It's not even that easy for house tracks to do that, but believe it or not, this one did. From what I've noticed, there were 2 main perspectives in this track. One side would say that it shows more intrigue than other Instinct tracks, while the other side would say that it's more of a snooze fest overall. I mean, I'm leaning more towards the latter, but it makes my list for an entirely different and oddly specific reason. If you listen closely, the vocal melody is pretty much identical to Dance Du Sol by Nico the Kid, which I've often listened to because of FIFA. And now I don't even know if that version is based off of something else. What I'm trying to say here is that not only is it dull, it also reeks of unoriginality once you notice the resemblance. So overall, it might be a bit more personal, but that's the difference between being forgettable and being a track that you want to forget. There were a lot of returns over the course of the year, some of which were from artists that I didn't really know too much about at the time, so let's just say one of these returns is not like the others. To start off, Have hasn't really impressed me this year. It's not that most of their tracks were bad, I just haven't really cared for this style overall. I feel like once I listen to enough of it, I can understand what makes Have, well, Have. All that to say, they are not the main reason why Full Speed is here, because their drop was actually okay. I just cannot get Topi's drop to grow on me at all. It just sounds like a bunch of stifled and randomly timed screeches, and not only is it hard to follow, it's a bit of a chore to get through. And the rest of this track, it could have been worse to be fair, but at the same time, nothing really makes up for it. Maybe the only hype around it was because of Topi's return? Because the production itself is just way too inconsistent for me to enjoy. Sometimes all it takes to make my worst list is to be one of the worst tracks for its respective month. Take, for example, oh, you thought I forgot about Rebel Scum's debut track. It was actually a tough decision as to which one of their tracks would end up on this list. While Endgame was just poorly executed, I would say Do Not Resist is worse conceptually. It tries to go for an eerie vibe in the break, and to be fair, it doesn't do that badly at it, but the drops ruin all of that potential immediately. It opens with an irritating siren before alternating back and forth between some growls that don't make up for it. And on top of that, the growls overpower the rest of the mix, and the other parts of the drop just sound tacky overall. It's arguably one of the worst debuts of the year, and it seems like Rebel Scum have had a pretty scummy first impression. I know I already talked about one bad drum and bass debut, but if you call in the next 15 minutes, we'll give you a second one absolutely free. Again, it was difficult to decide which was worse between this and Do Not Resist. Now, I don't know too much about Mackie G, but apparently he's best known for his track Tour, which I think is a bit more of a meme now, and I don't really care for it overall. So I kinda get where the hype is coming from, but it is even less going forward compared to what Rebel Scum had. The break is rather linear, the progression to the drop is a bit sudden and lacking in tension, and the drop itself, not only is it annoying, it sounds like it wants to be annoying. There's a quick repetitive back and forth as it alternates between abrasive synths and the offbeat Neurofunk stab, and it isn't even the first time I've heard that offbeat stab before. Is that something common in Neurofunk? If so, I can see why I did not enjoy listening to most of what Neurofunk had to offer this year. It kind of hurts having to put this artist on here, considering his debut has been one of the main things that at least try to justify the new schedule, but that doesn't mean all of his tracks have been successful. I guess Guerrilla Warfare is similar to Thrones of Blood in that while I can kind of see the appeal, I don't really care for the album overall. And here I thought Hit 'Em Like would be the worst one from that album. Now, Sultan is interesting. I had to listen to his Mirage sample pack, and while it's extremely weird, there are glimpses of potential. At the same time, I wouldn't be too surprised if most of his stuff was like this, because it is extremely inconsistent. How about we start with the positives? The music video is good, and so is the start of the track, and the first drop is okay. Just a shame that the second half is awful. If most of the track consisted of the last two drops, I feel like this track would be much higher on my list because it is simply unbearable. So overall, it's safe to say that Diesel has done a lot better. The rest of this album proves it. This ended up being a 4-horse race for the rest of my list. In particular, the next 3 were pretty tough to order because there were different flaws that made each of them unpleasant. So if you thought I was done with controversy before, this is gonna get ugly. Dr. Rishu has grown off me a lot quicker than I expected. I thought he had potential with his debut, but there were multiple factors that went against that potential, from his live sets to his run form on the Disciple label, but this track just might be its biggest factor. I'm almost lost for words at how terrible the drops are. The badly timed metal pipe just does not work whatsoever. And on top of that, he changes up the rhythm in the second drop and somehow makes it even more insufferable. So overall, it's clunky, it's obnoxious, it's offbeat, and it's basically everything I don't like about Rhythm. This used to be my number 1. I don't think it deserves to be up there, because the artist behind it hasn't really had a terrible year. He had a release that was over 9 minutes long and chock full of different genres, so at least you could say that he tries to be ambitious. However, his run of form on Monstercat has been very inconsistent, and of all the tracks I've heard from him, this one might be his absolute worst. It is weird to think that this was the whales behind Dead to Me from 7 years ago. Nowadays, he seems to be more of a hit or miss artist at best, and most of his misses have been through his Rhythm releases, and this one's no different. There are 2 main issues with the drops here, the first of which being the constant and cringe-worthy vocal chops, which get annoying very quickly, and the second issue is with the randomly timed rhythm stabs, which get more overbearing in the second drop. And the stabs overpower the drop as well, making the mix a complete disaster. A messy production of an already weird concept, which makes it even more disappointing considering what Whales can do. So you're telling me that Corolla was on the main stage set of Tomorrowland this year. In terms of her run on Monstercat, it seems like her style leads more towards Clubhouse. And in terms of festival sets, she's not alone in this at all, by the way. There were a lot of Clubhouse-based acts this year. Take, for example, Fisher and Gordo, to name a few. I shouldn't go on too much of a rant about it, but I haven't really cared for Corolla's releases on Monstercat until the middle of this year, where she released her second double single. I think a lot of people expect me to put Groove Master on this list. To be fair, it is extremely one-dimensional, but in and of itself, it doesn't annoy me that much. At least, not as much as her other track. This is an example of a tech house track gone completely wrong. I mean, it's difficult to make tech house intriguing in the first place, and the drops here certainly don't do that. But this time, the drops aren't the main issue. If anything, the worst part about it is that the drops are the best part of the track. Let's not mince words, the vocal samples are atrocious, especially with how they're utilized in the break. And that's what ends up being the last straw for me. One of the biggest lows of the house influx, because at least other tracks can maintain some sort of melody. I didn't really want this spot to be too obvious, but who am I kidding? The rest of the list might have been unpredictable enough. If I made this list last year, then this artist would easily have been in my #1 spot. So in the end, after taking into account the production, the timing, and most importantly the content, I don't have any other options here, do I? Until recently, I had no idea how Gigi McGree was still getting chances on Monstercat since, you know, that track from last year. Maybe I'm just livid because that was my first impression of her. Although she has experimented with some EDM this year, it felt like her primary style was emo rock. And having those tracks on the Uncaged label, I think it's a bit of a disgrace. And I would say this track is the main reason why. Poor production all round, and the suggestive and vulgar content in the lyricism seals it as arguably the most unbearable track on the label this year. And there was absolutely nothing to make up for it, thereby making it the worst Monstercat track of 2023. But now it's time to look at the other side of the spectrum and talk about the best tracks of the year. Every track on this list stands out in at least one of these 4 categories. They're either really energetic, really emotional, really innovative, and or just really fun to listen to. So let's talk about the honorable mentions. And we start off with Buckshots by Boss Fight. The moment where I finally understood the hype for Boss Fight this year. And the second drop is a great highlight in this track, Infortunate by Castor. It does very well to reference the classic O Fortuna opera, and it's a standout for its respective month. Every Little Thing by Conroe. It was very close to making my list, and I would say it was Conroe's best this year. While the vocal chops aren't perfect, the triplet style is executed very well in this track. Hero by Grabbits, a strong mid-tempo production with a really cool second drop, and the vocals pair well with it to provide some extra energy. Nova by Mazar and Livingston Crane, one of the few drum and bass tracks that I really liked this year. A simple but effective drop that's carried by the guitar leads. We've got great vocals from Livingston, and it sounds like it belongs in an anime. Justify by Nomana featuring Voicians. Another example of the vocals making a track stand out. It certainly isn't in the same echelon as the likes of Yesterday or Out of the Dark though. If it was, it probably would have made my top 5 this year. Arcadia by Pixel Terror and Ace Aura. The return of Pixel Terror combined with an intriguing color-based style from Ace Aura. The theming around it is really nice, and that's the main thing that makes it memorable. Lightbringer by Skybreak, a statement of a debut. It's difficult to decide which drop is my favorite between the first one and the last one. Be Alright by Slippy. It took some time for me to realize that Slippy has actually been cooking in the past few years. The sort of piano-based synth is really fun to listen to, and the choppy rhythm is utilized well to make it stand out. And for the last honorable mention, Night by Vesk Green. Arguably the most underrated of these honorable mentions. It's a bit simple, but it's not often we get tracks like this on the label. It's an earworm that is simply perfect for a night drive. And with that out of the way, it's time to talk about the best Monstercat tracks of 2023. Hey, remember when we had the likes of Hardwell, Martin Garrix, Dimitri Vegas, and Like Mike, and many others provide consistent standout sets? Nowadays, it feels like dubstep and hardstyle sets have more to offer than house sets. At least on Monstercat, there are some, if not many, artists that you can rely on to provide some energy. Isn't that right, Crank That? I've known about Crank Dat for quite some time, ever since his Trap Queen remix. And he's done well with multiple genres, from future bass to dubstep, and now bass house. And this one from the Slaughterhouse EP stood out to me. It reminds me of Jaws, not quite the Jaws from Rock the Party or Feel the Volume, but more like Jaws a few years later with tracks like Alpha, Infected, and I Hold Still, which I almost forgot was also made by Crank Dat. This one's just built to be a banger for festival sets, with a catchy electro house break and an energetic and somewhat frantic bass house drop. And as polarizing as the whistle is, I personally really like it because it adds on to that energy and it doesn't intend to overpower the rest of the drop. So overall, it's a great track. Not much else to say from here. So here's a bit of context. I started to pay attention to Monstercat rankings in and around August, and while it wasn't my favorite month in terms of releases, I think it was the month that had the most to talk about. So let's start with Arm & Hammer's EP. It has its fair share of highlights, but it does have some forgettable tracks to be fair. And that's the thing about Arm & Hammer this year. Some of their tracks just don't really click because either they have questionable mixing, or they're just lacking in something to make it stand out. But as a progressive house producer myself, I really wish Instinct had more releases like this. It's interesting to see Arm & Hammer producing house this year. Till the Day I Die provides a solid piano house style. Lifeline has a simple yet somewhat effective drop combined with some great vocals. And while Imaginary Friend has a good concept, I could just tell the leads had too many harsh frequencies. So I would say September Nights is my favorite from their EP, providing a cleaner mix compared to Imaginary Friend, combined with a nice bass progression, a great lead melody, and some solid emotion throughout. And although the vocals aren't consistently great, there are moments of brilliance. Not sure if we'll be seeing more house from Arm & Hammer next year, but it's pretty nice to see them try something outside of their usual melodic dubstep style. Looks like Ray Volpe might be a mainstay on this label. This year, he released Volpatron Ascends, which has been fairly solid for the most part. Although he has had some overrated releases, I'm looking at You Happy Song, he has also had some very underrated ones. This is why you should listen to the entire track before jumping to a conclusion. It's a great example of how to combine multiple genres into one track, and it's pretty much the opposite of Romani Adventures, in that it gets better as it progresses. The first drop is probably my least favorite of the three, going for more of a call and response tactic. And even though the call is good, I'm simply not sold on the higher pitch of the screeches in the response. But then it half-times into more of a trap drop, and I would say it's more energetic, or at least more intriguing than the first drop, but I would say the main highlight of this track is the final drop. Now, let's get one thing out of the way. I do not like how oversaturated techno has generally been elsewhere, but Ray Volpe makes it work very well as a closer here. The kick, it isn't overbearing, and that allows the ARP, the vocal chops, and other ear candies to sit well in the mix and provide more of a villainous tone. and that's what won me over. And like Arm & Hammer, I don't really expect Ray Volpe to continue producing house next year, but we'll see if he can prove me wrong again. Look, I get that he may have had a step down from last year, but how can you have a top 10 best list and not have this artist on it? To the surprise of probably not very many people, Bad Computer has been one of my favorite Monstercat artists this year. He has been consistent in providing a style that excels in one of two things. It's either fun to dance to or it has very intriguing sound design. And I would say this one leans more towards the latter. It does take a while to get going, but Jordan Grace does well to set up the scene with his vocals. For those who don't know, Jordan has done vocals for a lot of house tracks, including Martin Garrix's Oxygen, so it is awesome to see him here. The first drop is led by emphatic phasing synths with a choppy yet catchy sort of rhythm, and the chord progression changes in an intriguing way as the drop progresses. And the second drop is an excellent switch up, going for a minimalist yet haunting breakbeat style, before going back to the style of the first drop. It is easily Bad Computer's best this year, and I can't wait to see what he has in store next year. And on the topic of tracks and artists that need next to no introduction, everybody and their mother had this as the best track for its respective month, and I can see why. I was a bit hesitant myself because it seems like it leans more towards a pop sort of style, but once I learned more about Grant, I was able to see why this style worked for a lot of people. I mean, it worked so well that apparently Dead Man Walking was a fan favorite last year, and this track is very catchy as well. Will J's vocals are great, and the production is a simple earworm for the most part. It provides for some intriguing vocal chops and synths, which are mainly utilized in the drops. And while it slightly grew off me over time, it still excels in its replayability. So overall, yeah, I can definitely understand the hype behind this one. There might be some debate as to who's been the best debutant on the Uncaged label, but in terms of who's been the best debutant on the Instinct label, there's only one winner. I'm kinda surprised that Used to Losing You was not in the top 10 of Monstercat's Best of 2023. It seemed like everyone was going crazy about it at that time. A collaboration with Hello World, who was a hidden gem from last year, and a duet between Luma and JT Roach. Looking back on it, it was a major example of what Instinct could have been, and technically also what Instinct could still be. But with all that being said, I think Talk to You is better. It's a progressive house track that's slower than usual, yet it still excels on an emotional factor. Sophia's vocals are really good, and Blanky's drops, while simple, are still emphatic, and they get better as the drop progresses and more ambience is added in. The production works very well with Sophia's vocals when it matters most, especially in the extended second drop. And with the fact that Blanky's releasing an EP next year, I'm very excited to see what happens from here. So I might be a bit redundant talking about the rest of my list, but I've really enjoyed listening to color bass and other similar genres this year. I've already mentioned Ace Aura, Slippy, and Skybreak earlier, but who else can I talk about? AU5, I would say, is a veteran on a Monstercat, as he's been providing releases for over 10 years on the label. And for this track, he partners up with Chime, who has been one of the most intriguing color bass artists out there. I highly recommend his Aetherborn album, by the way. There's a lot of interesting stuff over there. And the other side showcases both of their styles excellently. It opens with an energetic chord progression, some nice tension in the build-up, and once the drops hit, they provide for some eye-opening sound design. I especially like how the last drop and the track as a whole ends with the chord progression it started with. That's an example of making the track come full circle. I will say though that this was a track that grew on me after a few listens, and to this day I'm still not entirely sold on the middle portion. It's a bit minimal and it's mainly prioritized by more liquid elements, but it does get better as it progresses, and obviously everything else about this track makes up for it very well. It's a great release from the start of the year from two really good artists, and it simply never got old. I'm not sure if I can call this an underappreciated track, but if you want to know how to make melodic dubstep emphatic again, I think this artist has an idea. Roy Knox was one of my favorite dubstep artists to listen to this year. As of recently, he's been mostly consistent in providing emphatic melodic dubstep. He's not someone who has always tried to rely on color bass. If anything, this might be the first track in a while where he's actually done that, and it is awesome. In the first drop, he provides multiple different rhythms to go alongside really nice sound design for the synths. And just when you think the drop is about to end, he extends it by double timing into a psytrance drop with those synths. The second drop goes for more of a minimalist psytrance sound, and while it isn't as good as the first drop, it's still very enjoyable. So overall, one of my favorites from Roy Knox, and I can't wait to see what he can do next year. So this artist first caught my attention on the NCS label over half a decade ago. Since then, he's been everywhere, from the Stamped label to Spinnin' Records, even had a couple of remixes on Revealed, and now he's on Monstercat. And while his debut is good, his follow-up is awesome. Retrovision, take it away. I love Color House. It's such an underrated genre in the Future House scene. And I feel like it's a genre that has been underutilized ever since Mo Falk first introduced me to it. Not very often do I listen to releases that astound me almost instantly, and Retrovision does that here. It opens up with an energetic electro house break to provide some hype and some tension for the drops. And the drops themselves are an amazing example of what Color House can be, prioritized by bright yet gated synths. And it took a couple of listens to get behind the change of the chord progression. It eventually felt triumphant and added onto the drops very well. I really hope we get to see more of Retrovision on this label, because this might be one of his all-time best. Monstercat prides itself on being a diverse label, in that there are many different genres you can find. So I don't expect everything to be full of energy or emotion. This is why creativity has been a growing factor for me this year. And I don't think you're going to find a better example of cohesive innovation than this track. If you're a Mario Kart fan like I am, this is a dream come true. Temanite returns to the label, and out of all of the artists he could have collaborated with, I would say Skybreak was one of the best options out there, coming from a great debut in Lightbringer to provide even more of a statement with Accelerate. The main thing that makes it stand out is its theming. The elements from the off drops paint a great picture of racing on Rainbow Road, or any Mario Kart course for that matter, and the drops do very well in matching the energy from those breaks. Remember how Temanite was one of the artists behind Sleepless? Yeah, you can see the influence in the first drop, providing a catchy melody combined with multiple ear candies to provide more energy. But the second drop ended up being the deciding factor, switching out that melody with a sudden and emphatic color-based punch, showcasing more of Skybreak's style. It ended up being the #1 track for Monstercat's Best of 2023, and in my opinion, rightly so. And that will be that for the best and worst Monstercat tracks of the year. Let me know of your favorite or least favorite tracks in the comments below. Also, if you haven't heard, I've got myself a little gaming channel, so I'd really appreciate if you check that out. The link will be in the description below. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll talk to you in the next video.